Hey everybody, this is Jonathan again, a Game Master Soapbox. Thank you for joining me for today. We've got a lot of things to cover today, and just like yesterday's program, I'm going to try to put between 8 and 10 minutes into each of these categories. In particular, when we get to the fourth one, 1 minute rant, I will be timing myself for a 1 minute rant in particular, and then I'll spend the next 9 minutes kind of going over it and explaining what triggered the rant. All right, so today the first thing we're going to talk about is our open Twitch RPG experiment. Now, I know many of you that are watching this are on the D&D channel and are used to watching 3 to 4 hour episodes of roleplay sessions. And today what I wanted to introduce to you is a different concept, and that is I will be opening up a channel program. I'll start it similar to this one, but it'll have different headers and such. And I will be intending to tell a roleplay game story, hopefully with you as attendees watching, participating in it by helping to administer and control the characters of the story. Initially, I anticipate between 4 and 6 players, but I do make this kind of an open challenge. I have run roleplay games for even larger groups, and I would love to be able to interact with you and run the game with as many as, who knows, 6, 8, 10, 16. The largest direct roleplay session that I've run successfully for a 4-hour window, and I got positive responses from everybody playing, was 17 players. But that was actually in an environment where I was dealing with them verbally, and in this case we'll be operating with your answers coming in text. So anticipate theoretically I could handle even larger numbers based on that. I don't know. We'll have to see whether that's the case or not. But I do want you to know that I'm going to be starting that. We're going to do those on Saturday mornings, Pacific time. Anticipating to be a 10 o'clock start time, but it might be a little bit later than that. But 10 o'clock in the morning next Saturday, which is, I don't even know, my calendar's not it, but today is, I believe, Sunday, so 1 week from yesterday. The second, the Open Twitch experiment will be a roleplay session. It will be in utilizing the NycosRPG system. The character sheets are available at NycosRPG.com, www.NycosRPG.com, which is my website. You can go there to get your character sheets. They are not yet fillable in terms of forms, so you'll have to download the form and create the character. Later on today, we'll be talking about quantum dice and how conflicts are resolved in it, and how that quantum dice mechanism is a change in the way people play. So to familiarize yourself with it, I'd recommend you take some look at the NycosRPG website. There is available for you for purchase the PDF version of the NycosRPG first volume, which is Dark Shards. That's specifically the fantasy setting, and in particular, it's got the rather extensive rules on how to create magical effects in the game so that your characters don't have, well, you'll find out so much more about it, but just know that the open experiment will start Saturday around 10 o'clock in the morning. We'll be covering a plethora of pieces, if you will, this Saturday, so consider this to be fundamentally the upcoming Saturday to be the session 0. And of course that will be recorded so that the data that comes out of that session will be available to anybody to participate, to get a feel for how to build a character and such like. We will be doing, I anticipate, today is, as I said, I believe Sunday, I don't even know. Yes, today's Sunday. So Wednesday morning, we'll be doing that open roleplay game session 0 precursor. So we'll be actually going over the NycosRPG mechanism, how to build a character and such like. So make sure you catch up with me on Wednesday for that. We'll be doing, by the way, the Soapbox every day. I'm going to anticipate doing so at 11 p.m. each night. It'll give me time to get back from my live games. I do currently 2 live games a week. And when we get a little bit later in the show and get closer to the Q&A, I'll be able to give you additional information on what particular is needed to get a character put together in advance, and also to let you know about that. Now, the game sessions that I run live are at the store of our sponsor. This is the logo over here in the bottom is Board Game Paradise. It is the best role-play game system. The best game store in the local area here, Redlands and San Bernardino, that kind of area of Southern California. But they do take care of online orders and such, so definitely get a hold of them. Make sure that you mention Game Master J, Jonathan Albin, when you talk to them, and they've got a special deal I worked out with them. The other thing about the Open Twitch experiment is that because I'll be operating with players online, my players who are members of my Patreon program will be able to jump on the line with me actively utilizing Discord, and therefore they'll have a front row seat, and there'll also be voices that you may hear beyond mine during that experiment, but those will be people who have sponsored me or participated with me in terms of my Patreon, and therefore are given special privilege. So if you want to be involved with that and get to know more, you can definitely check out my Patreon, which is patreon.com/NycosRPG, just Nykos, just the word Nykos. Nykos, by the way, is the name of the fictional homeworld, if you will, for the role-play games that I've developed. And the fictional setting is set on, the fantasy setting in particular is set on the world of Nykos. So there's a lot of information out there. If you put a search out there for NycosRPG, and Jonathan Albin, you'll be able to find anything you need on that. And additional information is available through direct contact with me or the other videos that I've done that you'll be able to see on YouTube. This program will be also, although I'm recording it on Twitch right now, it will be also broadcast on YouTube as well in the next few hours once we get it done. We've got a few more minutes yet coming up on the end of this specific portion. So let me go into the rest of the experiment. The way the experiment will work is I want to see if we can do role play in an environment where the player input is put in by the viewers of the show, not necessarily just characters who have arranged to be on the show visually. I'm not going to be necessarily therefore having a group of characters, but if I do, I've got the capability right here in this block of area where you see the text would be where I would be able to put up maps, images, and such to help enhance the role play experience. Now, if you notice, every once in a while I'll look up and look at you in the eye or whatever, and that's because my camera is above my line of fire. So please forgive me for looking, out into the audience directly, other than looking into the camera like this, only because of the way it's positioned. So that's a technical detail I probably didn't need to share, but you'll find I'm pretty open book when it comes to things like this. Now, the other thing about the Twitch RPG experiment is that it will have references to role-play mechanisms you may be familiar with, but it will also include the NycosRPG mechanisms that resolve conflict much more quickly. So therefore, fight scenes and action sequences don't take the long dribbled time that you might think of in terms of the rambling of a traditional role-play game. And so I'll go into more detail on the Wednesday morning show. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the next section we're going into, which is the Game Master Vacuum. Those of you that play role-play games and have for a long time realize that a good game master is difficult to find because, quite frankly, there aren't a lot of good mechanisms for teaching the ways to do this portion of the job, so to speak. And there's also a much larger group of people that would want to play than to actually be the storyteller or administrator. So with that, I wanted to mention the fact that the game mastery vacuum is expanding, in that for a long time, the mechanisms for being a storyteller and game master were integral to the game. In other words, when role-play games started back in the 1970s, and I started when it actually, arguably, either just before or right after it launched in 74, 75 window. the mechanism for play was such that the game master's rules were included in the same volume as the player's information. And therefore, everybody that had access to the rule book, so to speak, had access to everything that they would need to be a storyteller. Now, over time, that has dwindled somewhat because, as products will do, they bifurcated the material for the storyteller away from the material for the players. And there were reasons for that. One of the principal reasons for separating the player information from the game master information is that there is a nuance of surprise and excitement that occurs when something's happening and you as a player don't have perfect knowledge. You don't have awareness of everything. Therefore, unless a player takes the effort to actually consume the game mastery information, it's often difficult to capture the pieces and the elements that would make it possible to adjudicate in the game. This led, therefore, early on into the quick and dirty distinction between the game master and the players. And that line became more intense as time went by because there were more people that were coming into tabletop role-play games that were coming from a video games marketplace, and therefore they didn't have access to the, if you will, the backside of what the information that a game master needs. And so therefore, even if they had a penchant for being a storyteller, they couldn't rapidly gather that information because it wasn't directly available in the frame of work that they were actually participating in. Give me just 1 second here. I'll do one other thing. Pardon me. Quick. Alrighty. So you just want to get back to this and make sure you're in the right place. Yes, we are. Alrighty. So therefore, the games mastery window shrank. There were fewer people who were game masters, and there was also a mechanism that was developed in computer video games, and I distinguish between them often when I'm conversing, and some people find that need to separate them unnerving or even adversarial. But the tabletop environment requires the social interaction and communication skills that may not be available on the top line, if you will. And so therefore, the players that came into the marketplace, the players who actually chose to pick up the dice, step behind the shield, and became storytellers, were at a handicap, which meant that the new game masters coming on were players first, and players much more directly than they were game masters, and therefore the idea of moving into the environment was confusing to them and difficult to pick up, and therefore they would come into it with the same mental tropes from the games they'd already played in, and then would utilize those in their own development of a story going forward. Now, those persons who came at it from that angle, therefore, would create a story frame that later the terminology became known as railroading, because the initial computer offerings, video game offerings, were themselves linear in nature, because the person creating them had an idea in his mind for how the story should go, and with the limitations that computer commands would provide, it made it difficult for them to convey options that would let players make other choices. Ironically, that is one of the things that makes being a role player in a video marketplace somewhat inhibited compared to being a role player in a tabletop environment, because you get to know what your limitations are. As a matter of fact, you learn, which, if you're talking about a video game that's got a video component where you're actually moving the figure in the game, then, which of course later became known as the tune of the game, and we'll talk about that in a later session. But the idea is that the tune, or the character that was moving on the screen, only had certain actions it was allowed to. One of the glaring examples I can think of was even in the 2000 era video games like Metal Gear Solid or things like this. Your character, in order to get through certain locations, would have to crouch. Now, perhaps another more resourceful person might say, why don't I just go around this object, or why don't I climb over it, or whatever. There wasn't a mechanism to do that. You had to follow the extreme limitations of the character in the game, and therefore you had to crouch to pass through. And that mechanistic limitation led to people in tabletop games feeling likewise that they would be restricted or constricted in their actions. And game masters fomented this by actually holding players to those limitations. This therefore leads to a reason for the game master's vacuum to increase further, because players who are now playing in a role-play game that was being run by somebody who had come from that kind of an environment, then they would put limitations on the players as well. And this led therefore to a poor experience. Either they felt railroaded or guided in their direction so that they felt like they didn't have any player agency, or conversely, because they were so now free in a classic tabletop role-play experience to be able to do anything, they felt thwarted when they played the video games as well, because in those cases they would therefore feel the angst of not being able to do things that a person could do in real life that you can't do in the video game. This is the reason why even until the last decade or so, the video game RPG experience was lackluster. Now, with the advancements that we're seeing with AI and faster processing and better video quality and better skin control of the wireframes or whatever, all of a sudden you've got more opportunities and more actions, and therefore games today are arguably considerably better than the old ones, but they're still falling short. Now, the reason why I also say the game mastery vacuum is expanding is that, yes, we've already got a limitation on the number of players. We've got a limitation on the number of game masters that are out there. Then you add video experiences like Critical Role or other online role-play mechanisms that allow you to experience role-play, but they then showed a different side of role-play that the rank and file, I guess you'd call it, the standard role-play game master had difficulty with. So, for example, there was multifaceted personalities. The game master's explanation style, the narrative style, wasn't as dynamic, and so by having to compare ourselves with professional voice actors and professional performers in a live session causes the game master to feel confused and less valuable, because they perceive perhaps they don't have the skill set, and therefore it becomes more and more specialized. Add to that the advent of professional game masters now. In the case of professional games mastery, that is a difficult nut to crack, because games are, we think of other forms of entertainment, and many of them are free. You can go out and play catch with your kids, or you can go out and throw a frisbee around or whatever, and those things don't have any additional cost other than the frisbee and any possible injury that might occur in the process. But the idea here is that the idea of paying a storyteller, a game master, makes the experience feel less game-like and more entertainment-like, and the quality of the output, especially in those more professional presentations here on Twitch or in other venues, does seem to lend itself to saying that a game master has to improve his skills. But the irony there is that therefore it raises the bar for a new game master, even one that comes from a play background, to move into the marketplace becomes more difficult, more challenging, and therefore they think they can't perform. Now add to that this newest nuance of licensing of role-play mechanisms, the ability to use the game tools to achieve what they were attempting to do in performance. And now you've continued to reduce the number of game masters that are willing to take that risk and to provide product. Now, the benefit of having a professional game master is obviously, in order to put a dollar value on their performance, they have to have some level of expertise in that to draw that. And therefore, new game masters coming on who are entering from the idea of, I want to be a free game master, or they even want to think about entering the pro game mastery world, now they've got a challenge because they have to have a much larger skill set. Now, the irony also is that the wider field of games mastery is beyond just the fantasy settings, and this is something that most game masters don't pursue. And therefore, when you say, I want to play a role-play game, but I want to play it in a science fiction setting, or I want to play it in a post-apocalyptic setting, or whatever, these new changes, these new processes, there's not really a mechanism for doing that, and therefore games masters feel thwarted because they're familiar with the games that they've played, but they're not ready to expand, and therefore there are fewer game masters that are full function and can do all those different things. So that these things have led to a reduction in games masters overall. Now, in response to that, and as a feature of Games Master Soapbox, I want to take some time and talk a little bit about the elements of an encounter. And so this is perhaps a teaching portion of the show. If you are a player, you might find this part less exciting, if you will, but I think if you're a game master, you'll find going through the elements of an encounter, it'll really help your game session be more useful. So when I say elements of an encounter, well, first of all, let me clarify that an encounter is not an entire game session, although an encounter might last as long as the full session would be by itself. So realize that when I'm speaking of an encounter, that encounter can be a micro portion of a game session, or it might be the game session in its entirety. But the elements of an encounter are the following. First of all, there has to be a scene, a place, a location, a temporal framework that defines the encounter. For example, if you are walking along a pier and you notice that one of the boats ahead of you is being loaded, but the people keep looking over their shoulder like they're afraid, there's something in that might be interesting to you, and that's called the hook. And an encounter, therefore, has to have some form of a hook that draws the players to that action. Now, the encounter could be a pre-planned one. In other words, I have an appointment with an underworld thug, or I might be able to get an audience with a noble in a kingdom or whatever. Maybe I'm coming across bandits on a highway. Maybe I'm finding a farmer who's got a problem with his plow. These are all examples of possible hooks for the encounter, things that will set up where these things will happen. So then once you've got your hook, then you also need to have the location, and the location itself could be the hook. If it's, there's a famed gemstone buried in that tomb over there, and we want to go and get that specific item out of that tomb. That is the entirety of the encounter, but the possibility of the engagement is the hook that brought you there in the first place. Beyond the hook in the encounter and the location, you have to have an idea of an adversarial condition. Now, that adversarial condition can be as simple as a lock or a trap or a mechanism, or it can be as detailed as a group of specific people that you need to resolve with. For example, if it is, as I mentioned, the highwaymen and the brigands on the highway, you have to therefore engage with one or more of them in order to resolve the encounter. And that encounter could be a full-on combat scene. It might be a contest between one person's skills and another. In other words, if you're trying to sneak past the guards, then it's a contest between your ability to avoid identification and their ability to stop infiltrators. So therefore, we have set up a contest. And then finally, it could just be a challenge to skills. In other words, you've gotten into the room and there's a box with a mechanism on it. You need to open the box, get the item out, and get out. That entirety will be checks against skills. So any of those could be the encounter, and the depth of the encounter is really dependent on the flow of the game. And some encounters are as quick as resolve a lock mechanism and get in the door. That could be the encounter. or it could be, like I said, a full-on group of brigands, and you have to either pacify them, drive them off, or take them prisoner, or succumb and run away yourself. These are all ways that the encounter might go, but the idea is that now you've got an idea of what takes up the beginning and the nemesis of the encounter. Now the next portion is the conclusion / continuation from that point. And so in many encounters, it's actually step A to get to step B. And now that's not necessarily in the steps in the form of a railroad. In other words, you must do A before you do B, or you must do both A and B, or you must only do B, or anything. The idea is that the conclusion of that encounter will be one of the possible results. And since the players choose which of those they wish to engage on, the storyteller kind of has to be open to move the elemental parts around to make it happen. The final portion of the encounter is the satisfaction / resolution of it, and this would include the successful resolution of a combat, the success of getting past the guard, or the adverse, of course, would be the opposite, the failure to do so. But any of those portions that resolve the end of the encounter then lead the story to move on without having to be within that framework. So when you think of the elements of an encounter, you can almost have to think of it in terms of a bubble. The entire bubble is the encounter. The description, the narrative portion of that is to set up the encounter. Then the player's decisions are the resolution of that encounter, and then the outcome of that encounter is the conclusion thereof, and then move on to the next part. Alrighty. I'm going to prepare for a second to do my 1-minute rant, because this is arguably my most fun part of the game and part of the show. The game, everything's a game to me, right? So, all right, 1-minute rant. We're going to set up so that when the minute clock on my little screen over here changes, we'll start. And having begun, then we will do exactly 60 seconds of the rant. Then I'll stop, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about the rant. Alrighty, rock and roll, here we go. Today's rant is action magnets. Now, if you have been at the table of a roleplay group, and you were involved with an action as a player, and another person in the group hears your action, and then immediately starts to interact with the game master on how they would resolve it, or what they would want to do in that specific scene, that person is an action magnet. You'll find these are more visually apparent when 2 or more sub-scenes or 2 or more player actions are separated by some distance, whether it be physical distance or maybe even temporal distance. So for example, somebody's going to talk to a guard in the afternoon, but at dinner somebody else is going to be doing something else. If that third person who is watching the action throws their words in to either of those conversations without being directed to, that's an action magnet. Now, the reason why action magnets are so difficult to deal with is that an action magnet does 3 things. Number 1, he's going to take the attention of the storyteller and game master, whether or not they allow him into the scene. So an action magnet, for example, usually this is a younger person and a younger player. Not always, it could be somebody with some experience as well, but it's somebody who feels like they have a particular expertise in the actions of that scene and think that they would handle it better, or they just want to be helpful, or they just want to be part of the action, and so they are definitely going to be pushing on it. And the point of the action magnet, the problem with the action magnet is that it's taking away from the player's action and literally taking the limelight away from the actor that is in the scene. And motion pictures, you don't have this activity, because when somebody does that, you just call cut and throw them off the set and move on. But when you're in a role play session, it's a little more nuanced, more difficult to handle. I'll deal with that coming up, but I just wanted you to understand that my rant is against the action magnet personnel themselves, and now we'll spend the next 9 minutes going over what needs to be done to deal with an action magnet. All right. That concludes the 1-minute rant on action magnets, and we are going to now talk about action magnets. Now, I have been game mastering for I think I calculated the other day something like 12,000 players. And it doesn't matter how many players you have at the table. You could have 3, you could have 4, you could have 10. But you will inevitably have one or more people who are, especially when you're first starting the group together, who are so excited about what's going on in the scenes, what's going on in the game, that they forget that they're not there. They're not part of it. There's a great little video by Dead Gentleman Productions I could recommend, and I do recommend, called The Gamers. And if you haven't seen it yet, definitely go and look that video up. The Gamers is an amazing short film put together by college kids from Oregon, and it is amazing. And Dead Gentleman Productions is one of my favorite production companies, and the guys that are in that group will know. And a huge shout out to them. And if you go and visit any of their materials, make sure you give them a shout from Jonathan Albin. They'll know me as the game market guru. I was involved professionally in business for a long time. But the point is that in their film, there was a scene where the characters are all theoretically asleep, except for one person. That person's on guard and on watch. And when that person begins to interact with a sound they hear, each of the players starts to put in what their input would be in the case of somebody approaching the encampment. But all of them are asleep, but the one who is actually in the scene. The limelight is on that one individual, and the game master, the storyteller, wants input from that one person. That's what we're looking for, is what that person is going to do. But everybody else starts to chime in. In that video, it's really clever because the game master goes, "Stop it, you're asleep." And in the video portion of the game, of the show, where they're actually showing the characters in the game, they're all standing up at the moment he says, "You're all asleep," and they all fall back down. Then he goes on to explain something else. The players, the main player hesitates a bit. They all start to put in their commentaries again. They're all action magneting to the scene. And the game master again has to say, "Guys, you're asleep." And again, all the characters fall down. But the point is that when the limelight is on a player, that's his moment to shine. And it's up to the other players to honor that and listen to the conflict, listen to it. They certainly have, as far as at my table, you have permission to hear those conversations, that action, but you can't interact with it. And so when you are talking about being an action magnet, what you're doing is you're sharing, you're stealing thunder. Matter of fact, we had a situation in the game where I created an object that could be found on a shelf in a store that was called Personal Thunder. And of course, then the joke was that one or more of the players who had been action magnets were accused of stealing the thunder of other people. But that's beside the point. The issue is that action magneting, especially early on in a role play experience, if you haven't done it before, is natural. It's perfectly obvious when the game master is expositing information that you as a player want to gather that information as well and want to interact with that. The downside is that you're taking away from the other person's experience and you're therefore hindering the flow of the scene. Now, advice to action magnets, and I'm looking at you action magnets right now. When you are an action magnet, what you are actually doing is you're taking away from somebody else's play experience and you're preventing them from dealing with the scene as they would see fit, and instead you're trying to insert yourself into that scene. I promise, as a game master, I promise that you will have your moment in the light as well, and you will definitely get a chance to interact with the information when it's provided by the player in the scene with you. Do what you can to, bite your knuckle, sit in your hands, whatever it takes to stay out of a scene of which you're no part. It's difficult. It happens, actually. The best of us will do it on occasion. But in a game session, the less action magneting that it gets done, the less interaction that is out of the story, non sequitur, whatever, the more those things are reduced, the more efficiently the time will be used, and the more likely you'll get your time to shine as well. Now, this is difficult for new and inexperienced players. So what I'm going to offer you is this piece of advice. When the storyteller is explaining the situation before he begins the actual interaction, make sure to clarify whether you're in the scene or not. Because once you have acknowledged that you're out of the scene, then you're more than willing to take notes, scribble down commentary, recommendations for the other players when they're out of the limelight and such, like things that you want to ask them and such. That's perfectly fine, because it's things that perhaps you as a player need to clarify on, but it doesn't necessarily include your character. It's also important to remember with presence of mind where your character is in the story. So if at the beginning of a private spotlight type scene, that you ask the storyteller, ask the game master, okay, where am I in this? Am I not in the scene? And if not, where I am? Because that way you'll have an idea of things like, how long does the conversation take? You can actually look at your clock and say, okay, this has been going on for 15 minutes. Certainly by this time, I might have had a response, and therefore there'd be grounds for making a out-of-game character contact. But fundamentally, the easiest way to get past being an action magnet is to try to keep track of how much time you have in the spotlight and be aware of how much time you're getting versus other players. And it is a game master's prerogative when that occurs. But generally, every one of us, every storyteller out there, every game master out there wants to make sure that every player is serviced with what they need to get from the game, what they need as far as input, and they're not going to be intentionally leaving you out. So just realize that as an action magnet, those moments when you want to jump in but you know you're not there, keep out of it, because when it is your turn, you certainly don't want somebody else to action magnet stumble into your scene and botch out the interaction either. So I've got to move on because I've got other things I need to cover, but just realize that the purpose of the action magnet argument, the reason why I'm ranting about action magnets, is that in a game session, it takes away from the individual play experience of a player, and it detracts from the overall time that the game master has to provide everybody with their time. So with that, we'll move on to other things, but I want to just thank you for paying attention to this. By the way, if you like what you're hearing on the show, make sure you follow the channel, click the like button down below, and share it with your friends. Let them know, especially if you've had experience with an action magnet in your game. Leave me a comment so we can get an idea of what that is. Share how you handle these moments of an action magnet, and whether you see this in your own games as well. I think it'll really help others to be able to see that. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you can, because it helps with the algorithm to get this out to more people as possible. And make sure you share it with your role-play games group to maybe even just open a discussion about action magnets. Maybe you're one and haven't been aware of it. Best way to find out is to open it up to conversation and share with us in the comments about that. All right, now the part everybody's been waiting for, and that is quantum dice. And it's talking about relativistic resolution. This is something I came up with in my game simply because I have been playing role-play games forever, and one of the most difficult challenges in the game, you want to tear your hair out, is actual combat scenes. Because in many role-play games, I'm not going to point my fingers at every storyteller out there. I won't point fingers at any of the storytellers out there, because I'm as bad as others. In that, prior to the development of the relativistic mechanism, the quantum dice rolling, I had a real problem with how long combat took. Pardon me. Players, when they engage in a fight scene, inevitably it comes down to they roll a dice. You determine whether or not they've successfully hit or missed the opponent. They resolve whatever damage they're going to deal. Then, after all the players have done that, or at some point during that, the monsters or the creatures or the opponents or whatever get their chance. You roll your dice, you determine their actions, how much damage they deal, and then the players have to track it off the character sheet, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And the higher the level of the character, the less like a fight scene it becomes, and more of a grueling slog. So the combat slog is like the enemy of any tabletop RPG, and the only thing in a way you see this even in video games where the bosses might have a huge pile of hit points, or they regenerate or whatever, and all of those modifiers to the combat make what I call the bam bam effect, the I swing you swing, I swing you swing element just keeps getting worse and worse. And so in order to overcome that, I realized that there's several different things that go into it. First of all, the mechanism of a dice roll target. This is the numeric value that the character's die roll must modified be above for the attack to succeed. And this is in Dungeons and Dragons and basically many other RPGs, any of them that have a life pool. Now, I've got an entire video on the evolution of role-play games, and I'm going to do another one on that here in the future. But the idea is that the concept of a hit point pool is an abstract that takes away from the mechanism of the game in reference to the way we ourselves interact with the reality in our world, so to speak. So the role-play game aspect starts to lose its luster when the bam bam effect, the slog of the combat, takes a conflict that might have taken 1 or 2 minutes, maybe tops, to have resolved in real time, ends up taking, by its own mechanism, at 6-second segment, if you're, 6-second round, if you are doing a minute of combat, that's 10 rounds. That's, if you get to the 10th or 12th round of a combat, that's what I really call a bam bam. You can't get through the enemy, you can't reduce their points to get effective, because there's nothing in that mechanism at all other than that die roll threshold. So what the quantum dice does is it changes mindset when you look at the dice rolls. And this, once you see it, once the light goes on quantum dice rolling, even regular attack rolls won't feel right. They'll feel somewhat arbitrary, because the reality is that nothing that we do is an absolute success. Nothing that we do is ever an accomplishment by itself. We have to do a series of things to get to a conclusion. And therefore, having one dice roll generate one success or one failure as the only outcome means it could be a long time to get through the opponent. And players, quite frankly, are a little single-minded when it comes to those kind of things, where the engagement matters to them enough that they must win at all costs, and therefore they're willing to continue to chop away at those hit points to make those pools go down to where they can overcome them. So here's the magic of a quantum die roll. Utilizing percentage dice mechanism, you can generate a success failure number that feels more realistic. For example, if you and I are swinging wooden swords at each other, and the other person is allowed to block about one time out of 4, let's say you'll hit your target. 2 times out of 4, you're going to hit their weapon and therefore reduce it. And then 1 out of them, you're going to completely miss. So that's at least 4 different results. And that doesn't seem fair that you only have a 1 in 2 chance, just a die roll targeting to get in. So imagine instead that the dice roll represents up to 4 results. So, for example, in the case of using percentage dice rolls, and let's use a relatively low-level character. If a relatively low-level character has a 1 in 4 chance of succeeding, 25%, then about a quarter of the time he should also get partial success. And what I mean by that is there might be part of his blows that maybe they don't hit the target, but at least they get past the weapon and engage in the armor. Maybe they stepped in a little closer, and therefore, even though their swing would have missed, they still come in contact, and therefore it's a partial hit. So the idea here is that there's at least a partial success and an actual success. And then beyond that, there's a third possible option, and that is that there might be a wild success, that you got your weapon past his weapon, and you contact him in the side of the head and do considerable damage and ring his bell, cause the conflict to be considerably in your favor. And then finally, of course, there's abject failure. Now I'm going to add one more to that, and that's the perfect swing. And then this is the elusive 1 in a million, or in this case, 1 in 100 chance of actually getting the perfect shot in. And so therefore you've technically got 5 results. Well, at that 25% chance, it seems 1 and 4 is going to be more likely, and so you're going to spend 75% of your die rolls going miss, 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 miss. That's ultimately unsatisfactory. So what the quantum dice mechanism says is, let's take that die roll and let's look at it in terms of a double up and something called a double down, or basically half value. If you double up on the success, so you go roll higher than what you needed, so it would be normally a miss, but now you consider the weapon might have followed through, you might have actually gotten them off balance or whatever, that becomes a partial success for any value between the die roll target and doubling that. So, for example, with a 25% chance of success, you have a 50%. So up to 50, 49, 48, those are all partial successes. Conversely, if you roll below the 25, you clearly hit, but how do you know that you didn't do even better than that? And so therefore, if you look at the value from a half standpoint, 25% doesn't come down really well. 25% comes down to 12 and a half. There's not a half marker on the dice, so it'd be a 13 or higher. So 13 to 25, you would get a wild success. That's, you got in there and you actually made some progress against your target. Finally, below that, there's a chance, however small, of a perfect swing, and that would be literally to hit the 0-1, because that means 1 out of 25, 1 out of 100 overall, you actually landed the blow precisely where you aimed for and do damage to your target. So that, when you were rolling the dice, therefore, each die roll gives you up to 5 responses. That mechanism by itself now changes the entire field, because if everybody has a chance to do partial damage, has a chance to perhaps get through when the opponent doesn't, these are all ways of getting a success out of what would have been otherwise a failure, and this therefore elevates the dynamics of the session, of the action of that swing, if you will. Now, I know there's people that are going to be mentioning in the chat, they're going to probably PM me directly and say, what the hell are you talking about? Pardon my French. What are you talking about? Because there are situations, pardon me, there are situations when you simply cannot hit the target, and the idea of giving extra partial attacks seems unfair. And no, Jonathan, it's not per swing. We all know that it's a 6-second segment of the combat, and I can swing a sword a lot more times in 6 seconds than just that once. And yes, I agree with that. The concept, therefore, is that the percentage bracket is showing how many openings within a turn you get that chance. So 25% chance, you'll land some damage. Above 25% chance, by most mechanisms, sorry, 25 was the target, you don't get it. So in D&D, the equivalent would be, I need to roll to hit, but I need a 15 or better to hit, because 15 or better means that 16, 17, 18, 19, or 20, that's 5 out of 20, which is 1 out of 4, so it's a 25% success rate. And that's all it gives. It's the only way in the Dungeons & Dragons game you can hit is if you hit above your target. Now, if you've got modifiers, that changes what the target is. I get that. So if it was a 15, but you've got a magic weapon or whatever, that opens the window larger, and therefore your chance of making damage increases more than the 25. But that wasn't what I was saying as a point. I'm saying specifically, you've already done all your mods and you have a 25% chance to hit. Now, a less than stellar attack can still land partial damage. And this is important because when we are looking at the success failure of a combat, it requires a complete failure on one party for the fight to be over. In other words, if I am the attacker and I fail, and you roll even a partial success, that's a success. And therefore, if you've succeeded and I failed, you now have won the combat. That conflict fundamentally ends at that point. Therefore, all the combat slogging back and forth doesn't matter. How many hit points the villain has left, how many hit points you have left, no longer matters. It's just the success or failure of the combat action, which stops the clock, so to speak. And now the conflict is over. When that occurs, when you've succeeded and they have failed, even if you have only a partial success. If you succeeded and they failed, you have won the conflict, and you as the player then can exert a condition on that player. What can a condition be? Well, we're going to go into that in later episodes, and alas, we're up on our time for this. But just realize that a quantum die roll mechanism opens up the window to possibilities of ending the conflict early, and more importantly, are ways of making the players feel like they're accomplishing more than simply hit, miss, hit, miss, hit, miss. More on that later. Now, we are coming up to my question and answer section. I don't have currently anybody in the chat with me to ask any questions, but if you have any questions you'd like to ask, make sure you leave them in the comment section here on Twitch. You can also leave them with the YouTube show once this goes live over there. And you can also PM me directly. I am gamemarketguru@gmail.com. GameMarketGuru@gmail.com. That's if you want to contact me directly. Or you can just leave a comment below or PM me directly through Twitch or YouTube, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. I am going to, since I don't have any other topics to cover, and we have reached the end of my outline here, I'm going to take a moment and go back to the idea of being involved with our open Twitch experiment. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to mention here at the end. If you want to be involved, simply come and join the Twitch channel as a viewer on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning Pacific time. I'll be here starting the experiment. It'll be under this channel, and of course up above it'll say NycosRPG as it already does, and then it'll say Dark Shards game session up above, and then therefore you'll know you're in the right place. Hop in, say hi in the chat. Once you're verified and I can see you in the chat, then you will be able to take on one of the roles of a character in the story, or offer your recommendations for this session. I'll go into more of that later, but just realize that's the first mechanism. Now the second mechanism is if you like role-play games and you want to be a part of the show via audio only, I do allow my Patreon sponsors, my supporters, to join that games group through our Discord channel. Once you become a member on Patreon, you're provided access directly to our Discord channel at the, I think it's the $20 level. Once you establish yourself as a member of the Patreon account, then you're given access to the Discord channel, and then you're allowed at any time thereafter to join in our live stream game on Saturday mornings. So I'll give you more information on that as we get to Saturday. But just know that channel is available, and you can get to it through our patreon.com/Nykos, NYCOS. And for more information, definitely check out my YouTube channel, which is going to be listed down below. And if you are also interested, make sure you like this show, subscribe to it, and join us at the next episode of Game Master Soapbox. Possibly every night at 11 p.m. Pacific time. I'll be here griping about something. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your watching. And if you didn't like the show, if there's something about it, thank you nonetheless for your watching it through to the end. And we'll catch you in the next episode. Have a great day.